Every story you have ever heard about Cleopatra is wrong. Not partially wrong, not slightly exaggerated, wrong. She was not famous for her beauty. The ancient sources, the people who actually lived in her time, barely mention her appearance. What they mention, what they cannot stop mentioning, is her mind, her voice, her political genius, the specific, overwhelming quality of her intelligence that made every person who encountered her feel as though they were the only person in the room. She spoke 9 languages at a time when the rulers of Egypt hadn't bothered to learn Egyptian for 200 years. She outmaneuvered the most powerful military empire on earth for 2 decades. She turned 2 of Rome's greatest generals into instruments of her own political survival.
Egypt is not a province to be swallowed, Caesar. It is a partner that can finance your entire vision.
An alliance, then, based on mutual need.
She ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the ancient world, entirely alone, in an era when women were not supposed to rule at all. And when she finally lost, when the last card had been played, and the last alliance had collapsed, and the armies of Rome stood at the gates of Alexandria, she made one final choice. The most defiant choice in the history of the ancient world. She chose death on her own terms, rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains. This is not a love story. This is the story of the last pharaoh of Egypt, the most politically brilliant woman of the ancient world, and the civilization she died trying to save. To understand Cleopatra, you have to understand what she inherited and what she was up against. She was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek ruling family that had controlled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great nearly 3 centuries earlier. The Ptolemies were extraordinary rulers in many ways, but by the time Cleopatra was born, the dynasty was in serious trouble. Egypt, once the wealthiest and most powerful civilization in the ancient world, was being slowly, methodically absorbed into the orbit of Rome. The Roman Republic, soon to become the Roman Empire, was the dominant military and political force in the Mediterranean world. And Rome had a specific, calculating, long-term interest in Egypt. Because Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. The Nile Valley produced grain on a scale that no other region in the Mediterranean could match. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the food supply of the ancient world, and Rome wanted it. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had maintained his throne only by paying enormous bribes to Rome, bribes so large they had nearly bankrupted Egypt. He had been driven out of Egypt by his own people at one point, fleeing to Rome to beg for military support, while his daughter Berenice seized the throne behind him. He returned with Roman soldiers, had Berenice executed, and resumed his reign, dependent on Rome, despised by many of his own people, the treasury depleted. This was what Cleopatra inherited when her father died in 51 BCE. She was 18 years old. She was supposed to rule jointly with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, as was the Ptolemaic tradition. She had no intention of ruling jointly with anyone. From the very beginning, Cleopatra was different from every ruler Egypt had seen in 2 centuries. The Ptolemies, her ancestors, had ruled Egypt as Greek outsiders. They had maintained the Greek language and Greek culture as the language of the court. They had not learned Egyptian. For 200 years, the rulers of Egypt had not spoken the language of the people they governed. Cleopatra changed this completely. She learned Egyptian, not as a political gesture, but as a genuine intellectual commitment, becoming the first ruler of her dynasty to speak the language of her own people. And then she kept going.
En χώριοι το ιατρικόι, καητόι των τρογλωδίτων, ματέν των 4, τόντε των κανόν.
She learned Ethiopian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, the languages of the Parthians, the Medes, Latin, and the ancient language of the Ethiopians. 9 languages total, each one a political tool, a diplomatic weapon, a way of meeting the people she governed and the powers she negotiated with entirely on their own terms. Without intermediaries, without translators, without the specific vulnerability of a ruler who can only know what their translator chooses to tell them. She presented herself at the temples of the Egyptian gods, not as a Greek queen performing foreign rituals, but as a genuine devotee, as the goddess Isis made flesh, the divine mother of Egypt, embodied in human form. The Egyptian people, who had never truly embraced the Ptolemies as their own, responded to her. She was theirs, in a way her ancestors had never been. But the political situation was not waiting for her to consolidate her position. Her brother's advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, were working to remove her from power. In 48 BCE, 3 years into her reign, they succeeded. Cleopatra was forced out of Egypt. She retreated to the Syrian border with a small army she had raised, and she waited for an opportunity. The specific quality of Cleopatra's genius, the quality that separates her from merely competent rulers, is what she did with that waiting. She did not panic. She did not negotiate from weakness. She waited for the right moment, and then she manufactured one. In 48 BCE, the most powerful man in the Roman world arrived in Alexandria, Julius Caesar. Fresh from his victory over Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus, the general who had conquered Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon, who was in the process of making himself the master of the Roman world. He arrived in Alexandria with a small force. He found Pompey already dead, assassinated by the advisors of young Ptolemy XIII. He found a kingdom in civil war, a 10-year-old king controlled by scheming advisors, and a deposed queen on the Syrian border with an army she could not use. Cleopatra understood immediately what Caesar's arrival meant: an opportunity, but a dangerous one. If Cleopatra simply walked into Alexandria, she would be captured or killed. She needed to reach Caesar first, before his impressions of the situation were fully formed, before her brother's advisors had completely framed the narrative in their favor. What she did next is one of the most audacious acts of personal, political courage in the history of the ancient world. She had herself smuggled into the royal palace inside a rolled carpet, carried past the guards, unrolled before Julius Caesar, alone, without her army, without her court, without any protection except her own mind and her own will, and the calculations she had made that she could win this man in a single encounter. Caesar was 52 years old. He was the most powerful man in the Roman world. He had conquered nations. He was not a man who was easily impressed. Cleopatra was 21 years old. What happened in that room is not fully recorded by history, but we know the outcome. Caesar did not hand Cleopatra to her brother's advisors. He did not maintain the neutral position of an arbitrator. He became her ally, her protector, and eventually the father of her first child. The ancient sources that dismiss this as Caesar being seduced by a beautiful woman are missing what actually happened. Caesar was one of the great political minds of his age. He was not seduced by beauty. He was encountered by an equal, a woman who spoke his language, literally in Latin without a translator, who understood Roman politics with the precision of someone who had studied it her entire life because her survival depended on it, who presented herself not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign demanding the restoration of her rightful throne, and who made Caesar understand that an alliance with Cleopatra was worth more to Rome than an alliance with a 10-year-old boy controlled by a scheming eunuch. She was right. Caesar restored her to the throne. Ptolemy XIII died, drowned in the Nile during the subsequent military conflict. Cleopatra was queen of Egypt. What followed was not a romance in the way history has chosen to remember it. It was a political alliance between two people of exceptional intelligence who also happened to find each other genuinely compelling. Cleopatra accompanied Caesar on his progress through Egypt. She showed him her kingdom, the temples, the monuments, the engineering of the Nile irrigation systems, the grain stores, the administrative apparatus of the most efficient bureaucratic state in the ancient world. She was not showing him a trophy, she was showing him an asset. She was making the case through the specific living evidence of everything they passed together that Egypt, under her leadership, was worth more to Rome as an ally than as a conquest. That the partnership between Roman military power and Egyptian economic power was more valuable than simple annexation. Caesar understood. He returned to Rome. Cleopatra followed, arriving in Rome with her son Caesarion in 46 BCE, and lived there for 2 years in Caesar's villa. The most powerful man in Rome and the queen of Egypt, openly, scandalously by Roman standards. Caesar had a Roman wife. Rome was watching. Rome was not pleased. But Caesar was not a man who particularly cared what Rome was not pleased about. And then, on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, 23 senators surrounded Julius Caesar in the theater of Pompeii and stabbed him 23 times. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. She left immediately. The most powerful man in Rome was dead. The political alliance that was her protection, gone. The father of her child, gone. And the wolves of Roman politics were already circling. She returned to Egypt, and she waited again. After Caesar's assassination, the Roman world fractured into civil war. On one side, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, young, cold, calculating. On the other, Mark Antony, Caesar's greatest general, charismatic, powerful, brilliant in battle. Between them, the future of Rome was to be decided. And Egypt, wealthy, essential, the breadbasket of the ancient world, was the prize both of them needed. Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus in 41 BCE. He summoned her, as though she were a subordinate, as though she owed him an appearance. Cleopatra's response to this summons is one of the great acts of political theater in the history of the ancient world. She came, but she came on her own terms. The sails were purple, the color of royalty, perfumed so that the scent reached the shore before the ship did. The oars were silver. The deck was hung with cloth of gold. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, attended by children dressed as cupids, and women dressed as sea nymphs and graces. The entire city of Tarsus came down to the waterfront to see her arrive, including, eventually, Mark Antony himself, who had been sitting in the marketplace waiting for her to come to him, and found himself walking down to the waterfront to see her instead. The ancient sources record that the marketplace was left completely empty, the entire city at the waterfront, and someone made the joke that Aphrodite had come to revel with Dionysus for the good of Asia. Cleopatra had not come to meet a Roman general. She had come to negotiate, as a sovereign, as an equal, as the goddess Isis. And Mark Antony, like Caesar before him, encountered in that golden barge something he was not prepared for.
Is this not more agreeable than a cold camp, Antony? Here, we conquer not with cold steel, but with pleasure.
Not beauty, intelligence, politically skill of the absolute highest order, complete, unintimidatable confidence in her own power. And the specific quality that the ancient sources keep returning to, that extraordinary voice, that ability to make every person she spoke with feel as though they were the only person in the world, deployed with the precision of a weapon. She had him, and she knew it, and he knew it, and it changed everything. What followed between Cleopatra and Mark Antony was the most consequential political partnership of the ancient world. They were together for 11 years. They had 3 children together. But this was not simply a personal relationship. It was an attempt to build something the ancient world had never seen. A fusion empire. An alliance between the military power of Rome and the economic and cultural power of Egypt, between the Latin West and the Greek and Egyptian East, that would create a new kind of Mediterranean civilization. Antony gave Cleopatra territories: Cyprus, parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria, portions of Arabia. Gifts that the Roman Senate viewed as an outrage. He was giving away Roman-controlled territory to a foreign queen. Rome was furious, and Octavian, watching from the west, cold and calculating and patient, understood exactly how to use that fury. He portrayed Antony not as a Roman general pursuing Roman interests in the east, but as a man bewitched, a Roman reduced to a consort, a soldier who had abandoned Rome for the bed of an Egyptian queen. It was propaganda, brilliant, effective, devastating propaganda. And it worked.
Citizens of Rome, hear the truth of Mark Antony. Our lands to this Egyptian queen. He is bewitched. Egypt threatens our very walls. How long will we tolerate this insult to the Republic? A foreign queen commands the master of Rome. We must act before our liberty is lost forever.
Rome turned against Antony. The Senate declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, on the foreign queen who had stolen Rome's greatest general. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's fleet against Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces. The battle was a disaster. Cleopatra's ships withdrew mid-battle. Antony followed her. His fleet, abandoned by its commander, confused, outmaneuvered by Octavian's Admiral Agrippa, surrendered. The war was effectively over. What followed was the most painful and the most defining chapter of Cleopatra's life. Antony received false information that Cleopatra was dead. He fell on his sword. Mortally wounded, he was brought to where Cleopatra was sheltering in her mausoleum and died in her arms. Cleopatra was now alone. For the first time in 20 years, there was no powerful Roman ally between her and the full force of Roman ambition. Octavian arrived in Alexandria. He wanted her alive, not because he had any mercy for her, because a Roman triumph, the great military parade through the streets of Rome, celebrating a general's victory, was most spectacular, with the conquered enemy displayed in chains before the victorious general's chariot. And the most spectacular triumph imaginable, the conquest of Egypt, the defeat of Antony, the capture of Cleopatra herself, required Cleopatra to be alive. He needed her, in chains, walking through the streets of Rome. Cleopatra understood this completely. She had spent her entire life reading political situations with perfect clarity. She read this one too. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 22 years. She had outmaneuvered Rome for 2 decades. She had turned 2 of Rome's greatest men into instruments of her survival. She had come closer than anyone in the ancient world to preserving Egypt's independence against the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean. And now, it was over. She had one choice left, the only choice that was entirely hers. The ancient sources describe what happened next with a kind of reverent brevity. She dressed herself in her royal robes. She put on her crown. She lay down. And she died. The exact method is debated. The famous asp, the Egyptian cobra whose bite was associated with divine death, the death of royalty, may be historical fact, or may be poetic symbolism added by later sources. What is not debated is the choice. Cleopatra chose the manner and the moment of her own death. She denied Octavian his triumph. She denied Rome its trophy. She died as she had lived, as a sovereign, as a pharaoh, on her own terms. When Octavian's men burst into the mausoleum and found her already dead, already composed, already dressed in her royal regalia, the Roman sources record that Octavian was furious. He had been outmaneuvered, one final time, by the woman he had spent years portraying as nothing more than a dangerous seductress. She was 39 years old, and she had beaten him. What do we do with Cleopatra? History has spent 2,000 years trying to reduce her, to make her smaller than she was, more manageable, less threatening. 2,000 years of paintings, plays, operas, films, and the overwhelming majority of them have told the same story. A beautiful woman who loved two powerful men and lost. It is the wrong story. The right story is this: a woman who inherited a kingdom in crisis at 18 years old, who taught herself 9 languages because she understood that knowledge was power, who walked into a room with Julius Caesar with nothing but her own mind as her weapon, and walked out with the most powerful man in Rome as her ally, who built a political partnership with Mark Antony that came terrifyingly close to creating a new kind of empire, who fought Rome, the most powerful military force the ancient world had ever produced, to a standstill for 22 years, and who, at the end, when everything was lost, chose the one form of resistance still available to her. She denied them the satisfaction. She died a pharaoh, not a prisoner, not a trophy, not a symbol of Roman triumph. A pharaoh, the last one, with her crown on, in her own time, on her own terms. Egypt died with her, the last independent kingdom of the ancient Mediterranean world. The civilization of the Nile, the pyramids, the temples, the gods, the 3,000-year continuity of one of humanity's greatest achievements became a Roman province. A grain supplier, a source of tax revenue, a trophy. Everything Cleopatra had spent her life preventing, but she did not live to see it as a prisoner. And that, in the end, was the last victory she could claim. And she claimed it. If this video made you see the last pharaoh of Egypt differently, share it with someone who thinks they already know this story. Subscribe to Legends of the Past, because next week, we are going to the court of the richest human being who ever lived. A man so wealthy, his pilgrimage to Mecca accidentally crashed the economy of an entire country. Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, the man who makes every modern billionaire look modest. That story is coming, and it will change how you see African history forever.